Our lesson will be primarily in Luke chapter 10 this morning. We want to again welcome everybody and say a happy Easter and to everyone who's gathered together. Got to see many people a little bit before the service started. Hopefully we'll get to see some more people afterwards. You know, if you've ever been to a singing, particularly a singing on maybe a Friday night or a Saturday night, usually somebody gets up and rightly says at the end of each singing, "What a day it'll be when we can all sing together in heaven with voices that never tire." And that's true, and that's something to look forward to. But I'm also looking forward to the next day that really our group can get together and sing a song of praise and be together and hug each other's necks. What a day that will be too, and Lord willing, we'll have that soon. Today, of course, is a day that many in the world, certainly at least in our country, remember the resurrection of Jesus. And while a lot of times people take verses out of context or ignore other chunks of the Bible, I think it's a good thing that people focus on what Paul would describe in 1 Corinthians 15 as a matter of first importance. He says those three matters of first importance were that Jesus died, that he was buried, and that he was resurrected. And in fact, he goes on in that chapter of 1 Corinthians 15 to talk about the idea that without the resurrection, our entire faith is futile, or it's in vain. It's of no hope, no glory, no benefit. And so praise God that we have a God who sent Jesus to not only die on the cross for our sins, something we remembered just a little bit ago, but also that he was buried and resurrected from the dead, knowing that this life isn't where everything ends, that no matter what happens in this life, that this isn't the way the story finishes. The story finishes with victory. Jesus has already paid that price. And so while we're here and now, we take advantage of all the good things God offers, family, right? We take advantage of the beautiful creation and even lean on each other for spiritual benefit. But remember, we're going to that better place and there's something worth living for. Of course, that's one of the examples that Jesus is trying to teach and impress upon all of those around him. And if you look again at Luke 10:38, you see two women who are both doing what I would consider to be good things. Again, looking at Luke 10, verse 38, I'm going to go ahead and try to get the screen share up here so you can follow along with the verses as we go. All right, so we're going to be talking about Mary and Martha, of course, in verse 38. A woman named Martha welcomed him into her house, and she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving. This is an interesting way to meet them. And of course, by the way, Martha is in the book of John going to be given one of the greatest statements of faith. She's going to recognize Jesus as Lord. And so nothing in this story means that Mary's perfect or that Martha is a failure or anything of the sort or in between. But in this moment, in this story, I think there's a lot of wonderful lessons we can learn. And one of the benefits, you might say, if you can dare to say such a thing, about this current environment is it's giving us a chance to rethink basically everything, right? It rethinks how we go to the grocery store. It rethinks how we worship, even what constitutes worship. It certainly changes how we think about stocking up on toilet paper, right? And hand soap. Never thought that would be such a scary thing to be without, but people are doing those calculations and literally fighting over it, right? Situations change, we reevaluate. And so what I want to think about this morning, and certainly remembering that what we're living for is greater, is look at Mary and Martha and see, where do I fit into that picture? So we have some initial observations about them. One of them is they're both doing good things. Do you notice that in verse 38 and 39? Martha is hosting Jesus. Now, certainly there's nothing wrong with hosting Jesus, and there's nothing Jesus says that indicates that's anything but a neutral or positive. And Mary finds herself where in verse 39? Sitting at the Lord's feet and listening to his teaching. Now, I think that's a very important idea, because as you think about what Mary and Martha are doing, we tend to just assume whatever Martha did was wrong and whatever Mary did was right. Now, I will say, when you sit and listen at the Lord's feet, it's very hard to find a problem with that. And so in this story, Mary is doing an excellent job. She really does a good job at focusing on what does it mean to put Jesus first and only in our lives. But of course, we have Martha who is hosting. And so you see that as we keep moving forward, that Martha has a problem with Mary. Right? So we see that in verse 40. Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. And of course, Jesus has an opportunity to put Mary in her place, or to say, Mary, why aren't you helping Martha? She's doing this good thing. She's being, we might call it hospitable, or she's having him over into her home. She's serving him, certainly from her point of view. But does Jesus take the bait on that? Does he say, you know what, Mary, you really need to get your act together? Well, no, in fact, he does the opposite. He says, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things. This is interesting that you have Mary who is not helping. Okay, that's an important point here. Mary is, at least from Martha's estimation, another interesting tidbit, not helping in being hospitable, not helping in doing this good service. Now, if we think about being a Christian, we think hosting is a great thing, and it is. Taking care of others, we studied earlier, and we're going to come back to it again, Lord willing, in a few minutes. Feet washing of each other, serving each other in a humble way, that's a great thing. But you notice what Jesus says when he refuses to condemn Mary. Verse 42, he continues, but one thing is necessary. What we learn from this story, and what I want us to put into practice during this time when we're reevaluating basically everything about our lives, is to realize that there are good things, there are great things, but there's only one necessary only thing, and that is serving God and serving him and putting him first no matter what. And what that means is, and even from the story, that there are ways to do what God says that come second in order to doing other things. For example, it'd be great to read our Bibles, but it would not be, I think, Christ-like to see somebody who's poor and in need, who we can help, and to stand in front of them to read our Bible silently and then walk away without helping them. Right? Reading your Bible is a good thing, but not doing nothing with what you read. What Jesus is impressing upon Mary and Martha is, look, you need to see the one necessary thing. I am the Son of God. I am here for just a short time. I need to be first. Our priorities need to be set straight. And so really, what I also want to see, though, in defending Martha is not just that she's some bad guy, but that even though she was doing a good thing, there was still a problem. This is important in the story. Jesus does not condemn Martha for being hospitable. That is not the charge. The charge is allowing it to do what to her? Well, verse 41, to be anxious and troubled about many things. There was no one problem unless you want to call it her anxiety and worry. This is a problem. This is what's standing in the way of her in that one necessary thing of verse 42. Mary, on the other hand, if you read with me the rest of 42, has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. Now, as you think about that, that's a really strong claim. In verse 42, Mary has chosen the good thing that will not be taken away. If you want a brief reason or a very brief bumper sticker type way to remember what matters, is verse 42. Is what I'm worrying about going to go away? And if it's anything in this life, you know what the answer to that question is? Yes. I want to say something serious and not be mistaken or lighthearted about it at all for a moment. This COVID-19 is scary and it's terrible. But we've had other diseases throughout our world history. There was the Cold War where we were constantly afraid of nuclear threats and armaments. But there's one thing that's always been certain before nuclear weapons, before war, and before disease, that we're not going to live here forever. And that has always been the case. But there is one thing that will always be there, and that is salvation in the arms of Jesus if we accept his offer and put him first. And see, there's all kinds of good things along the way. And what I want us to see is not just don't go do terrible things, don't be a liar, don't steal, don't take life, but also even good things like Martha's doing can get in the way of the better things. So as we're reevaluating our lives, we need to see that Jesus is teaching us a pivotal lesson in priorities. All right, so what do we do with this lesson? Well, first of all, let's see some lessons from Mary and Martha here. One of them is in verse 41, we need to not worry about the many things. And that's going to be really important because he specifically says that in 41 and 42. But now we have to stop and say, okay, well, what are those many things? Well, first of all, let's remember our rule of thumb. It has to be something that lasts forever or has an everlasting impact. Now, I would argue that taking care of one another, washing each other's feet, being hospitable to others, that is something that is lasting as long as it's because of our devotion to God, as long as we're doing it in the name of worshiping him. There are plenty of people who reject the idea of God entirely, but still occasionally do something nice for one another. But that's not doing things in the proper priority order. You see, Jesus says there's an order to this. He doesn't condemn Martha for hospitality. He condemns her for being anxious and not missing the most important thing. All right, so some that are benign and some that are even kind of good. One of them is, and I hope everyone's wearing shoes at home comfortably right now. I know probably not, but we're going to try to step on some toes here for a minute. You know what doesn't last? College football. College football does not last. Now, there's a lot of people who forget that. I know there's a lot of Alabama fans even here listening to this sermon this morning who forget that there was a time before Nick Saban was the coach. Now, those are considered the dark years, or for Auburn fans or other fans, I would assume the light years. But you know what? The fact of the matter is times change. Teams get good. Teams get bad. You know, Koshka and I, in fact, one time went to a Gator game, and her wedding present to me was Gator tickets. We went to the Gator game where the team lost to the worst and the lowest ranked team in the history of UF football. So if you hear her giggling in the background, that's because she's proud of that perfect present. It was a great time, and we enjoyed it. But as important as college football is, it doesn't last forever. And so here's a question. Do I take my faith as vitally important as I do being at my TV on a Saturday in the fall when my team is playing? And you say, okay, well, that's easy. You know, I don't get into the football, or, you know, I understand it's secondary. But what about if I'm playing the sport, or my kids are playing in the sports or in band? You know, I enjoyed many of those activities growing up, and Koshka did as well. And those are good things. But they become a problem at a certain point. And what have we learned from Mary and Martha? At what point do those many things become a problem? Well, when one of two things happen. Number one, when they replace the better thing, that is putting God first. Or number two, and this, I don't want to read over this in the story, when we get worried and anxious about them. One interesting thing about the complete cease on all activities is it really makes us think about what time we do have with our loved ones. I don't just mean in a how long do we have way. I mean do you realize how much time we spend just driving here and there, eating here and there? I saw one statistic once that said Americans consume about 20% of their meals in the car. And I don't know how each of your families are. There's probably some families here who do it about 40, 50% of the time, and some that might be 5 or 10. But either way, that 20% is a high number. Not a problem, not a bad thing. In fact, you could have great quality time in a car. You know what I've heard car time with your family as, right? Not just a good opportunity to talk about Bible things, but a great opportunity because they're what you call a hostage audience. They are buckled in and stuck, right? That's an opportunity to take a good thing and make it the one necessary thing. We can't get caught up and worry about things that don't last, whether we're involved in them, whether we just enjoy them, or even if it's a kind of good thing. Sometimes we're so caught up in checking off boxes of service that we forget our faith has to be renewed. Our relationship must go one direction, me to God. No one else can have the relationship I can have with God. And it doesn't matter if my family's great at things, if my wife is a rock solid Christian in her faith, or if I even am really good at doing a lot of things. If my faith with God is weak, nothing else matters. So we have to make sure we don't worry about the many things. We'll have more to say about that in our Wednesday night Bible series, Lord willing. But I also want to note something in 40 and 42 that's interesting and I think causes a problem. And this perhaps plays on her anxieties, Martha's anxieties. We have to learn not to compare ourselves to others. Right? In Luke chapter 10 again, in verse 40, notice that as she is distracted with much serving, which isn't a very complimentary phrase, by the way, from Luke. Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her to help me. There's all kinds of things that can be said about that. And of course, for those of you who are quarantined in your homes, I would imagine once or twice you've heard your kids talk about something being fair or unfair, or compared to how things are going for one another. I'd imagine that's happened once or twice. But Jesus doesn't take the bait on that. In fact, he tells Martha, you know what? Mary's actually a good example in this case. But even if she wasn't, would that have changed that Martha was distracted with serving? Even if Mary was helping Martha, would that mean that Martha was some sort of success, that she was putting Jesus first? No. In fact, it would just mean that two of them were distracted with much serving. Do you see the problem with comparing ourselves with others? It not only does no good, it takes our eyes off the goal. Now, I will say, and this is alarming, and this is very troubling, and we'll just have to be honest about this. There is someone we are supposed to be compared to, but we don't really like it. Because I'm supposed to be comparing myself, my life, my faith to that of Jesus. Peter describes, I believe in 1 Peter chapter 2, as walking in the footsteps of Jesus. Right? Am I walking in the footsteps of Jesus? Am I compared to Jesus? I really don't like to make that kind of comparison. You know why that's scary? Because he's a lot better than me at being devoted to God and his causes. In fact, how much better? He is perfect and had to die because of my imperfections. That's pretty scary. And so what I like to do instead is I like to compare myself to others and say, hey, they should be doing what I'm doing. I'm doing all this good stuff. And Jesus says, no, you're missing the point. It's not about Mary at all. It's about me. Right? In verse 42, notice again what he had said. This one thing Mary has chosen, that good portion, it will not be taken away from her. Why not? Because Mary chose to sit at the Lord's feet. She chose to value that which is lasting, that which is important, that which makes a difference. That's a powerful example for us. To realize it doesn't matter what other people do. It doesn't matter if the world is wicked, and it doesn't matter if the world is righteous. I have to do what God tells me to do. And I certainly can't find myself worrying about it. I wonder what I could do with all of my time, or Martha could have done with her time, if instead of being fixated on what Mary wasn't doing, she actually stopped and did what Jesus was telling her to do, which was to look at what Mary was doing. Do you see? I think that's the capital offense here. Notice, what is Martha's perspective of Mary in verse 40? What is she not doing? She's not helping me. But Jesus says, no. What should you see? You should see the one thing Mary has chosen. Right? The other problem with comparing ourselves is we're missing the boat. We're missing the point. Instead of looking at someone's good examples and learning from them, we just want to point out the bad. That's an unhealthy habit that not only is negative to our relationship with them, it certainly is unhelpful in our relationship with God. So not only do we need to not worry about many things or compare ourselves to others, we need to make sure we find and recognize that which truly matters. That which, as we might say, has a lasting impact, a lasting desire built within us, because we know there's something in heaven and greater coming. Now, as you think about what that means that we have to do some soul searching here. And in all that time that we have and that we're thinking about all of these different struggles and all of the pandemic going around, we have to stop and say, you know what? God is the only one who will get us through this. Again, we might talk about this in a future Wednesday night series, but I want to stop here for a minute and think just through several Bible examples with you of some problems. God works in mysterious ways, and he uses men and kingdoms of men and fortunate circumstances for his will to be done. But there's a difference in trusting in those kingdoms and trusting in God to use the kingdoms to fix our problems. And so I want to ask a question this morning in recognizing what truly matters. When we think about the pandemic, are we fixated on and focused on the next time that we get a shipment of ventilators or masks? Are we focused on relying on China of all places, or even ourselves, to pick ourselves up by our bootstraps and solve this problem? Or do we think God actually is the solution to this problem? And someone said, well, I pray for it every day, and that's good. I hope we do. That's a wonderful thing of putting God first. But what we need to do and see is that when China or America or Canada or any nation helps us, when we get through a crisis, it's not because man is strong, it's because God allowed us to use that country to get back up. What truly matters is that God gets us through. And that's a big difference. And we're Americans and we'll pull through. No, God will pull us through. God always knows who his people are. He knows what they're struggling with. And the truth is, sometimes we struggle with recognizing God even in moments of weakness. We call out because it's all we can do. But whether it's Ahaz and relying upon foreign nations, or the people who would often rely upon themselves or their idol gods, man has shown in biblical and world history to constantly trust in might and power or false gods, rather than truly relying totally on God. And there's a difference there. And so I have to do some reflection today. Do I recognize what truly matters? Do I recognize God can and will solve this problem? Or do I think that America just is on its own and yeah, God's there somehow doing something I don't know, but we'll get through it. There's a difference. If we're people of faith, we need to act faithfully and know that God will get us through. Pray with conviction, pray with certainty, not as some sort of faux faith healer, but as a Christian who knows that our faith can move mountains. So those are some interesting lessons. And as we conclude, I want to look at some application for today, 3 points. First of all, let's take this time to reevaluate our priorities. In Ephesians chapter 5, a passage we looked at before, I think this is a great passage for all that we're facing today. In Ephesians chapter 5, note with me verses 15 through 17. And by the way, if you're wondering if this was used in our lesson on Wednesday night, the answer is yes, it was. And if you think it'll come up again, the answer is probably yes, I think it will. In Ephesians 5, 15 through 17, notice what Paul says. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Think about that. Redeeming the time, making the best use of the time. Whether you are running like a chicken with your head cut off right now, 24/7, getting no sleep because you're on the front lines. And again, I desperately thank you and want you to know I know so many people here who are so wonderful and gracious are praying for you. Or you're someone at home and you have more time than you thought, or a different amount of time than you thought based on the way it's being used. Use this time to say, hey, what's been cut out in my life that I desperately miss? You know, one thing I desperately miss, it's hard to miss it because I haven't got to know y'all too well, but just worshiping with Christians, being with y'all, how much I desire and Koshka desires to be with you, get to know you better, and to hug your neck and sing those songs of praise we mentioned from the beginning. That's something that I hope we realize. I hope each and every one of us who are thinking about our Christian walk realize God knows what we need, and boy, do we need each other. I hope we see that's a need. I hope we also see that we have a need, frankly, for social interaction. Whether you're kind of introverted or extroverted, at some point, you need to talk to somebody. We just need it. We recognize that's a need. But I also wonder if there are some things in this period that have been cut out that we say, you know what? That actually was a net negative on my faith. That kept me from praying like I should. That kept my family from Bible study as we could be doing. That's kept me from being the kind of spouse, child, friend, family member that I could be. This is the time to examine, am I really redeeming the time God has given me? Let's use that opportunity to His glory. And I understand this will be some tough conversations and could lead to some tough choices. And no choices are easy. To cut one thing just because it's for that right thing doesn't mean there's not a sacrifice. Jesus in Matthew 10 suggested that those who would follow Him would have to be willing to hate their mother, hate their father, hate their mother-in-law even, to follow after Him. Sacrifice cost us something. But Jesus is teaching Martha that one thing is worth giving up everything for. Not only should we not be distracted with worry, not only should we not be worried about others, but we need to say in my life right now that I am taking a chance to reevaluate this entire setup of how we live life day to day in America. Is this for my positive or is it for a negative? And remember our bumper sticker slogan, will this last forever? If the answer is no, it needs to be really low on our priority list. If the answer is yes, we need to make sure that rocket's right up to the top of the list. And we need to start putting that into practice today, not tomorrow, not in a week, today. You know, I've seen some people mention on the internet, various Facebook and Instagram ideas. They'll say things like, if you don't come out of this storm and this self-quarantine, this self-sheltering with some sort of new skill, you wasted your time. I think that's kind of interesting. If you're someone who happens to have that kind of time, that's good use of it. There's all kinds of YouTube videos and everything else that can teach you different trades and skill sets. But I want us to think for a moment, let's say we get out of this in May or June. I want to know when I look back, will I have known that I could have redeemed the time for God better? Could I have grown my faith more? Could I have reached out to others in a more effective way or a more efficient way? Did I really redeem the time? I need to be careful because as verse 16 says, the days are evil. I need to not be foolish and understand what the will of the Lord is. I think a second application for today is to make time to listen to God and wash feet. Make time to listen to Jesus as Mary did and to wash the feet of others. Let's go back with me to John chapter 13. John chapter 13, it's where we had some of our thoughts in the eulogy this morning. But in John chapter 13, after Jesus has washed the disciples' feet, which, by the way, one of the interesting things that would bring that on is the disciples were arguing over who's the greatest. Can you imagine the humbling lesson Jesus would have taught them? They're saying, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus gets down and washes their feet and says, by the way, if the master washes feet, what should his servants do? They better be washing some feet. And then, of course, there's the instance with Judas. He tells Judas, go and do what you have decided to do. But eventually you come to John 13, and notice in verse 31, when he had gone out, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify in him and him himself, and glorify him at once. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me. And just as I said to the Jews, so now I also say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. We need to make time to love one another in this sacrificial way. Jesus doesn't just say that we should wash feet. He absolutely commands the idea of selfless servitude. Do you see that standard in verse 34? We are to love others just as I have loved you. How did Jesus love us? Well, in this chapter, he washed feet. But later, we know in the Gospels, he was sacrificed on the cross for our sins. And by the way, who did he wash the feet of? Judas. Who did he die for? Us, sinners, those who rejected him, the Jews who put him on the cross. It's very likely in Acts chapter 2 that there were those in the audience of Peter and the other apostles' sermon who had put Jesus to death, who had witnessed it, who were related to somebody who helped put Jesus to death. Perhaps even among those who said, his blood be upon us and our children. What a terrible thought. But what an interesting time we have today to make time to make sure we're listening. When Jesus speaks to us and gives us this command, what do I do with it? Does it kind of go in one ear, kind of rattle around my brain on Sunday, make me think I should do better, and then Sunday go out and go back to living the life for me? That's why we need to reevaluate our priorities. Make a list today, maybe in your sermon notes, or maybe at home on some sort of board. You can write somewhere what your number one priority is. And every day, make sure you do something or some many things to accomplish that goal. And by the way, what is that goal? Let's just say it. To put God first. Do you have some extra time right now? Listen to the word. The elders have daily Bible reading, which is wonderful. There's all kinds of Bible reading, audio Bibles, there's sermons, there's anything you could want on the internet today with a way to study the Bible from even people we know and love, from family members near and far around this country. So many faithful churches have sermons up, have commentaries referenced. They have all kinds of bulletin articles. You can find what you need. The question is just, do we have an ear that is willing to hear and listen? Mary saw Martha serving and hosting. And instead of helping her in a way that led Mary to try to chastise her, Martha, Mary's sitting at the feet of Jesus. Do I find myself at his feet? And secondly, when I have sat at his feet, do I go forth and serve? In Matthew chapter 7, in verses 24 through 28, that Jesus gives the example of the two different foundations. Do you remember what they are? There's the foundation of stone or rock, and there's the foundation of what? The foundation of sand. They both were foundations, but they both also faced the storms of life. And when the storms came, the wind blew and the rain beat on the house with this firm foundation, it stood. But when the storms of life hit that sand foundation, it crumbled. What was the difference in the two foundations? Both heard the words of Jesus, but the one with the strong foundation heard the words of Jesus and he did them. Part of our priority lesson is not just to realize we should put God first, it's to take action in putting in God first. And so our application today is not just some brainstorming session, although that's good. Please do. Take some time to think about what's important and also take some time to realize what's unimportant. But step 2 is to actually do it. Make an action plan. I'm thankful a couple had texted us about the tornadoes that are possible today. And the big thing we've learned up here is to have an action plan. That's important to someone who's used to hurricanes because in hurricanes, as I've shared with you before, The action plan in Florida is to watch where they think the hurricane's going to go. And if they say it's going to hit you, don't worry about it because it's not. Right? You worry when it's supposed to go right past you. That's when it's going to turn and clobber you. That's been my decades of Florida experience. But even then, you have some sort of plan. In a hurricane, you board up the windows. In a tornado, told you find the right place for shelter. You make sure you have food. You make sure you have things ready to go and protected, those things which are of value. But you make a plan. This morning is not a lesson just to say, hey, we need to have our priorities right. That's an application. Jesus didn't want Martha just to say, you know what, you're right, you are important. He wanted her to put him first. So yes, evaluate what's important, but secondly, make an action plan. And that's going to be different from all of us based on our way of living life. Your opportunities are different than my opportunities. How will we use them is how we're going to answer to God at judgment for. What do we do with the doors he opens for us? But I want to leave us with one more concluding thought. And again, something I think that likely we'll cover on Wednesday. We need to know that God will take care of you. Remember, Martha was described as being anxious and worried about many things. There's another reason that that's a problem. And in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus identifies it. In Matthew 6:25, he does say very clearly, do not be anxious about the things of this life. But as you skip down, there's a really critical reason as to why this anxiety is such a problem. The very last phrase of verse 30, "O you of little faith," in 31, "therefore do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear?" You notice these basic necessities of life are considered a faith problem if we're anxious over them, if we're worried about them. One of the reasons that getting caught up in good things that aren't the great thing are so problematic is they take all our time. There's nothing wrong with Martha hosting Jesus. In fact, I would argue that's a good, if not great thing. But you know where the problem lied? In that she didn't sit at the feet of Jesus, or at least she wanted others to not take their opportunity to sit at his feet. The question is not, will God take care of us? He has promised that he would. Why not worry, verse 33, if you seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, all these things, those basic physical necessities, they will be added to you. In verse 34 even, don't borrow worry. Do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. We don't need to worry because God will take care of us. And so when we set our priorities, we need to make sure that we're putting things that don't take up all our time, that aren't the thorns of the sower's field. In Matthew 13, in the parable of the sower, those thorns which choke out with the cares of the world, that precious word of God from our soul. Focus on what matters. Don't let Satan distract you thinking that God isn't caring for you or he won't take care of you. He will. He does. He has a 100.00% track record. That is awesome, isn't it? That we don't have to doubt. We don't have to fear. All we have to do is trust, and as the song we often sing says, obey. And so Mary and Martha is a fascinating story for us to consider in Luke 10:38-42. That Mary was doing the great thing, that one necessary thing, knowing that Jesus would take care of her. And notice again, what did he say at the end of verse 42? Yes, she cared for that one necessary thing. Yes, she was at the feet of God, but it would never be taken away from her. This week as we live, I want us to focus on what really matters. I want us to see that God will never desert you. He will never forsake you. That which truly matters is that which we should strive for with all that we are. Good things are good. Sports are fun to watch. They're fun to play. Family time is special and unique. But putting God first, from the dad and the mom in the house to the smallest child, is going to be the thing that lasts. Faith is the victory that overcomes the world. Praise be to God that Jesus has already won the battle. Let's fight with him. Put him first, and this week encourage one another as we strive to redeem the time.